At this point, we want to open it up for questions. We're looking forward to a vigorous and vibrant discussion here. I'm going to ask a few questions, a very few questions myself, and then we'll take as many from the audience as the ambassador can bear. There was a lot of criticism from some of the newspapers internally that the president and perhaps the government did not take enough leadership when this happened to speak vigorously against it. And I'm wondering whether or not you think that is fair, and what the government is doing now to deal with some of the underlying issues, I think, which you say that have not been so well understood.
Yeah, firstly, I think that when government responded and said that it was important to identify what is the actual nature of the problem, because there was a lot of speculation. And somebody, some smart guy somewhere, came up with the term xenophobic attacks. And that phrase became the catchphrase that clouded the situation. As I'm indicating, is that of the 62 people who lost their lives, about 12 of them were South Africans. Let's not just have one description, one solution, and just say this is xenophobic attacks, or it's a third force violence, or it's just criminals taking over, but look at the combination of factors and begin to address the problem.
If I can just follow up, how does the government plan to follow up and address the problem?
Well, first, I mean, is to deal with the whole immigration policy. It is going to be a very difficult thing to deal with. But unfortunately, again, we have the Home Affairs, which is not functioning in the manner in which it's supposed to function. It's almost non-existent. Lots of problems. That's the most corrupt department that we have. At some stage, a task force had to be put in place to try and deal with the problems in that Home Affairs.
It's my understanding that certain members of the Congress, and perhaps Congressman Payne might chime in on this, have introduced legislation that would remove the ANC and Mr. Mandela, who, as we know, will turn, I believe, 90 years old next month. Perhaps it's July 18th. What, in essence, this legislation would remove the ANC and Mr. Mandela from the U.S. terrorist list. It's my understanding also that the legislation has passed the House, but it's stuck in the Senate. So my question to you, Mr. Ambassador, and to others who are here, particularly with such a distinguished group as the African Society, what is the status right now of this legislation, to your knowledge, in the Senate? What can we do to make sure that this legislation is passed in time to at least celebrate the 90th birthday of one of the most renowned Africans that we can celebrate in our time, and that's Nelson Mandela?
Yeah, let me say that we have had a lot of cooperation from the State Department, which is the one that started piloting the project. And of course, when Congress took it up, there was a lot of interaction with the people who were driving the process. We've been able to clarify and resolve certain questions that were hanging in the minds of some people as to whether they should support the process or not.
Yeah, I'm Carol Thompson at the Africa Bureau of the State Department. We are extremely supportive of the bill. The administration strongly supports the bill, the State Department, the NSC, Department of Justice, et cetera. So to the extent that sounds like we're arguing on the same team, that we very much want the legislation to pass.
Something that the members of Congress had difficulty with, of course, removing organizations from the terrorist list is an administrative function, and initially we attempted to have this done administratively. However, it was just taking too long.
Mr. Ambassador, I was a little not pleased with the fact that South Africa, under Mandela's leadership and others, continue to struggle with trying to create a non-racial society. So what can you say that will help us in advancing our cause while you are struggling with your own?
You know, we're inspired ourselves by your own struggles to rid yourselves as slaves and free yourselves from slavery, and the struggles that have been taking place here gave us hope because the circumstances were almost the same. One of the issues that I've mentioned is that when I say some of the most ignorant people about what is happening in South Africa are white South Africans. Some of them have not moved from their suburbs to go 15 or 6 miles away to discover precisely what is it that apartheid has done. They're still struggling to understand and find it very difficult that this is the kind of issues and problems that we have to deal with as a country. But I think a lot more South Africans are beginning to understand and appreciate what this freedom has brought about, because it has freed all South Africans. One of the things that have helped us, I mean, what used to be a predominantly white sport, rugby, whenever that team plays, South Africa unites. Because they win, and two, they are the best in singing the national anthem. So they've set an example. So I mean, the small things like those, they can help. We've got to identify a number of other areas that culturally, I think there's a lot that is happening that is beginning to unite South Africans.
That the current administration seemed to have been rather unenlightened about the severity and seriousness of HIV/AIDS a couple of years ago, and I was wondering what is the strategy or the philosophy that currently exists in addressing HIV/AIDS in your country?
UNAIDS and even the World Health Organization have been on record to have said one of the most comprehensive plans that have been developed to combat HIV and AIDS has been in South Africa, and that is a fact. A partnership that developed, which has been very difficult to get it going, between the private sector, the NGO community, which was advocating on these issues, and government in rolling out the programs and ensuring that, in fact, all the issues that are related are attended to. Most of the clinics now have units that deal with this particular pandemic and rolling out ARVs and giving all the necessary support that needs to be given to the people that were infected. But it has also been necessary to locate the highest prevalence and begin to analyze and deal with the situation, say why here and there, some aspects of it. From our own budget, one of our highest budget allocations goes to this particular sector, dealing with this pandemic and, of course, creating the infrastructure to deal with such a situation. I think we're making progress.
One of the stark differences that exists or has existed, it may be changing a bit now, has been what appears to be the difference in strategy that exists between the US and the UK versus many African leaders, nations. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why there does seem to be a different understanding between nations in the West versus African, and particularly Southern African nations. If you could maybe talk a bit about what accounts for that difference in interpretation and strategy.
I don't think it's a difference of interpretation in the strategy. It's the question of who wants to take responsibility for what. You know, the problem in relation to between Britain and Zimbabwe, let me put it that way, started largely at the end of the transitional period that was agreed upon in Lancaster House, after the 10 years ended. Unfortunately, a new administration was in place, and the Labour Party was not necessarily forthcoming. At that time, even the conference that was organized to try and deal with this issue, 1978, organized by the United Nations, some of those commitments were again reinforced. But unfortunately, I must say the British government reneged on some of their responsibilities. I think the British government started mobilizing the European Union and other allies to impose sanctions against Zimbabwe. I think that's where the problem started expanding. The US also joined in that process of doing so. But what we did as a country, for a very long time, we had an agreement both with the British and I think also with the US. Give us a chance, let's work on these things, let's see what we can be able to do. Don't make the kind of statements and implement the kind of measures that you are putting in place, because we are creating more problems in terms of the relaxation of the minds of Zimbabweans. But I think after they went into their own kitty and paid off whatever was due to the IMF and hoping that we'll get a new facility, and it did not come by, that's where I think a bigger part of the problem started, in the relationship and the attitude towards between Zimbabwe and some of these countries. And their open support for the opposition. I think that also created the problem in the relationships that started existing.
And I think this is a question which he was trying to ask was a question that frustrates a lot of South Africans, or did when I was there. But I think what she was trying to get at is there's a lot of pressure, certainly from the West, saying South Africa as the powerful democracy, the leader on the continent, should do more to pressure Zimbabwe to act, should do more to criticize Zimbabwe, and should respond in the way that the US and the UK and others have in being very, very critical and pushing harder.
So we can't create and exacerbate a problem by dealing with that situation recklessly. We've been tied together with the Zimbabwean people by history and geography. Some of the people who are in the south of Zimbabwe actually came from Zululand and during the movements, and were the same people. So we can't approach the situation in a manner in which is insensitive to the realities of how we have all come together or developed together. We're going to do it differently, and we continue to do it differently. And we're very happy and satisfied about the way in which we've been handling that situation, because we've been able to avoid circumstances which could have worsened things. The loud noise and criticisms and sanctions and everything else that has been directed towards Zimbabwe has not helped to solve the situation. Actually exacerbated that situation, obviously. And Zimbabweans are very proud people. They know, very educated, even more than South Africans. And I think they're capable also of resolving their problems, very much aware of their challenges. And we cannot, as South Africans, begin to treat Zimbabweans as our 9th or 10th province, and little kids that have to be told by us what to do. They've never done that to us. Why should we start doing that to them when they're in trouble? So you can rough up if you want to, but we're not going to. That I can assure you. We're not going to do that.
What if, in fact, observers of the election say that the election was again stolen? What options would you see the international community having in that case?
Well, the international community must take the cue from the Africans. We've got institutions that are in place and principles that have been adopted which govern these processes. The AU in 1999 came up with a policy and a position on what was defined as unconstitutional governments, reversing coups on the continent and acceptance, non-acceptance, and recognition of any body who comes into power unconstitutionally because it was becoming too fashionable. Any government that refuses to hand over power to an opposition that has clearly won, that will also be regarded as unconstitutional governance, and that will not be accepted. That government cannot be accepted as a government that is legitimate. So the purpose of observers is precisely to be able to attest to the free and fairness of that election and be able to say whether that election was free and fair or not. And if that is the case, if the worst scenario comes about, then it means the principles that have kicked in the past will have to kick in, like in this case. I think the international community must begin to respect the majority of Africans. Where we fail, we'll call upon your support. Don't step in first because you create problems if you